Harvey's here, but we do have the reps from the Devonport Takapuna local board, so I think we better move on in relation to item 12, because it's 11:30, or 11:25. So maybe if Dr. Gillen and Mr. Cohen want to come forward and speak to the speakers from the local board perspective. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Kia ora, councillors. Good morning. I wish to speak to this motion on behalf of the local board and this item. And the local board was unanimous in its position in wanting to retain this part of the reserve and to not sell it. So there are two parts to the argument. The first is on the actual potential sale or the proposal to sell the part of the reserve, and the other is a concern at the process that was undertaken. So as I said, this is not a philosophical issue, it was a unanimous view of the board based on the perceived need to retain this piece of the reserve for a number of reasons. The first is that the local board intends to develop a holistic view of the use of the reserves in our board area and to assess the various reserves for the potential for, say, destination parks, neighbourhood parks and so on, and this work hasn't been done yet, and so therefore it is premature to sell off any of our reserves or parts of our reserves until that work is done, because it reduces the flexibility of the board to make decisions in this area. The other is the board is embarking on a very strong walking and cycling connection throughout the board area, and this access way provides an important connection route from the neighbourhood on one side of Woodside right through to connect up the Sunny Nook shops, including the major supermarket in the area. The concern also is the piddly $10,000 valuation placed on our part of the reserve. And so the board also expressed concern at the process that was taken under. And I've heard around the table today about the need for the board to be seen as part of Auckland Council and not as separate. And when it comes to parks and reserves, actually the board is considered to have landowner status. So when it comes to consents, the board provides or withholds landowner consents for issues. And yet, although accepting that the board doesn't have the ability to buy or sell property or land, including parks or reserves, when it comes to selling land, the board is deemed to be probably in a lower position than most other stakeholders. And in this case, a number of internal stakeholders, council stakeholders, were consulted. The board was ignorant of the proposal to sell this land right up until the department concerned had actually made the decision to approach council to sell the part of the reserve. And the board, unfortunately, was then placed in the position of having to defend its position and oppose a proposal for sale rather than being party of the discussions right at the beginning. And so this prevented the board from undergoing consultation with its own stakeholders in the area, including the neighbours and the community. So what we would ask is, in the future, when parks and reserves or any property in a board area is to be undertaken, that the boards actually consult and there's discussions with the board prior to the department making a de facto decision to recommend such a thing to the governing body. And so that consultation hasn't taken place. The other issue that the board has is that this area is zoned under the PAUP for quite intensive intensification and development. And when that occurs, then every parcel of land that is there as parks or reserves will be required for the families and the children of that area. And no one that I know of has ever torn down a building or a house and built a park. And yet we often see our parks being sold and developed for what is really privatisation and intensification. So the board asks that this piece of parkland is not sold and is retained to allow the board the flexibility to develop and use that park as it sees fit for the future community in that area. I also note, just in closing before I hand this over to the Parks portfolio holder and former Chair Mike Cohen, that the items in 11, 12 and 13, it says in 11 that it serves no public purpose and not regarded as an open space asset. And in 12, no alternative uses for this portion are identified. And in 13, indicate that this property is not required for current or future service requirements. And I'm not sure where those comments actually came from, because nobody asked the board. Nobody approached the board and said, you know, do you have any future use of this? Do you see this as valuable public space? Until after the department had actually decided that, that this was a piece of land fit for sale. So again, I just ask that in the future the board is part of the initial process and is not left trying to defend what is in effect a departmental decision to the governing body. And Mr Chair, I think if we can indulge your patience of the committee, my colleague and board member Mike Cohen have a couple of comments to make.
Well, we'll have to be brief.
Very brief.
I mean,
You had more than
that's
5
the
minutes.
board's position. Is this a... Is this,
I'm always brief, Mr
no,
Chair.
but is this the board's position or your position?
The board, it's a unanimous decision
Yeah, I
of the
know
board.
it's unanimous,
Yeah.
but you've presented for the board,
Oh, okay.
okay? Okay, well, you can make a very brief comment.
I'll give apologies for our chair.
No, well, I think...
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking on
Just
behalf of the
one comment that I would like to make, I obviously totally agree with my colleague, is that I was actually utterly surprised when I found out yesterday that it was actually on your agenda. Here's an item, $10,000 we're talking about. Every time I'm told when you do a council report, it costs about $5,000. So by the time the transactions actually finish, I suspect council will get $2,000 or $3,000 out of it. So the question is why there is such enthusiasm and spare capacity in council that they're actually dealing with this item of 10,000. And I think that also comes back to the hub of it, that if they actually consulted with the local board right at the beginning and says, look, we've had this approach.
That's been covered though, Mr Cohen, so...
Sorry?
You're covering what the deputy chairs already...
I was looking at the materiality of it,
Well, yeah.
which I think is actually, given, Mr Chair, that you're very a strong supporter of where we can cut out cost in council and the impact on ratepayers, I'm just wondering why there is such enthusiasm and energy and capacity time that's actually gone into this item, full stop. And perhaps councillors should be asking that question.
Because we have a policy of disposal of property.
somebody else.
That's part of our property. It's a policy of this council. So the officers are just following on that policy. For your information.
As I said, it's a matter of respect between the two organs of Auckland Council. Okay.
Thank you. Any questions of Dr. Gillen or Mr. Cohen? Any questions? Councillor Casey?
How would you go about measuring the utilisation of that piece of land? How do you, when you do your review of parks, is that one of the things you'd be looking at?
Sure, and I think if we look at the map, Kathy, there's quite a few fronts to that reserve. One of them that's currently used as an access way is seen to be potentially a children's playground and a more developed area, which means that access way that is under discussion at the moment is really important to be retained as an access way as the other one gets filled in. As I say, if we sell off part of it, and cut off that access way and connection, then it actually reduces the flexibility of the board to make those decisions going forward, as we're in the process of doing.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'll move that we thank the Devonport Takapuna local boards for coming in and presenting on this matter, seconded by Councillor Casey. I'll put that motion. Those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Declare that carried. Thank you very much. Do you just want to grab a seat at the table or just wait on the I'll ask the officer now to come forward.
Cheers. That's fine.
Letitia, welcome.
Thank you. I'll just start with a few comments. The property in question, the address is 24R Linwood Avenue. It's currently an unformed, non-utilised access way, as you've heard, of approximately 130 square metres. It leads to a larger recreation reserve known as Linwood Reserve, and it was vested as recreation reserve in 2006 following a subdivision from a private landowner. This property was progressed when Panuku Development Auckland, or ACPL at the time, received an inquiry from the adjoining landowner who told us that she had been maintaining this property and she wished to purchase it to incorporate it into her property. This wasn't one that came to us from a council department, so we followed what's our standard process for purchaser inquiries, where we then went to the relevant council department, which was the Parks team, and to ascertain if they wanted this property kept in council ownership. The Parks team, Parks and Recreation Department, informed us, reviewed the site and informed us that they'd reviewed it against its parks policy and found that the site does not provide any formed linkages to the larger reserve, Linwood Reserve, and it serves no useful public purpose for access or open space. And it was confirmed that the Parks, Sports and Recreation Department does not require the strip of land to be retained. Now, following this, we ran it through our standard process, which we always seek to get the operational perspective before we seek a governance view on matters. So our first stage was to run it through our internal consultation process and seek expressions of interest from council departments. At that stage, the Devonport Takapuna Local Board's relationship manager was included in the email, so the board would be aware of what was going on. That was sent in May of this year. And following that, we then undertook local board engagement. Now, it took a bit of time to actually do that initial engagement just because of time frames, other workloads. As you're aware, Panuku was going through a transition to our new organisation, so we were working under quite tight time constraints. I actually had numerous conversations with the board's senior advisor about this, and I also the senior advisor actually asked if I could provide an extra month to allow the board time to do site visits and go and view the property. I provided that extra month. I would have been more than happy to provide more time if it was requested, but the request never came through. So I'm not sure if there is a miscommunication between board members and what was passed on to me through the staff, but we never received any further requests. But I've got a long paper trail that when further time was requested, it was provided. Just a few other things to note. The valuation that's been provided for the report is a desktop valuation. It's very much an arbitrary figure for reporting purposes. The actual value of the land will be determined should the governing body approve the disposal of the property. It would need to go through a survey and subdivision process. So that would be what would ascertain the value of the land. So, and like I've talked about when I've been at this committee before, what we'd look at is if an adjoining landowner incorporated this parcel of land into their land, it may change, say, the subdivision potential of this site, it may change its zoning under the proposed Auckland Unitary Plan. So all of that would be taken into account, but we're very, very mindful that we don't want to incur the cost to council of actually doing this work until we're aware of what the governing body decides, because it may well be a complete waste of everyone's time and resources. So we're waiting for a governing body decision before we figure out if we proceed with that, and that would be what would provide the valuation. It is set up as, or it would form part of Panuku's normal terms and conditions that we run through, and we always seek to obtain best value to council. Also, in how we run this process for when we receive purchaser inquiries. We're very, very mindful of the fact that these are often portions of land which have a very small value, so the costs, regardless of the outcome, are borne by the person who's making the inquiry. Otherwise, there may be a negative cost to ratepayers if it was, say, our time that was being used to pursue these. So I hope that answers any questions that you may have, but I'm happy to answer any further questions. There's just one other point to make. There is a fully formed accessway, and this was the point of the parks team. And I've also done a site visit to the property. 3 or 4 houses up the road, there's a very wide, open, fully formed accessway. Now, if you see from the photo that I've included in the report, this is a very, very small accessway, and if that was to be formed, it wouldn't actually meet community safety guidelines for an accessway. It would be very dark, very narrow, not very safe. The accessway up the road, and that was part of the park's decision as to why this particular slice of land wasn't needed. The accessway up the road is fully formed, it's light, it's signposted. I was there on a very dark and overcast day. It felt very safe and secure walking around there. I think if this was, the subject site was to be formed as an accessway, personally, I wouldn't feel terribly safe walking down there, particularly on a dark day if it was night time. So that was part of the rationale for why parks didn't require this particular piece of land. Other than that, happy to answer any questions.
Can I just ask, what's the cost of lifting a reserve status on this bit of land? Have you worked that out? Or